So just a couple of weeks ago, early on July 24th, 2020, an 18-year-old woman named Gia Fuda, who was living with her parents in Seattle, Washington, wakes up in their home, goes downstairs, says good morning to her mother and to her father. She has a sip of a seltzer water, and then she heads out to her car and says, okay, I'll see you tonight, and she drives off. Gia's mother said that because of the quarantine, all of Gia's college classes had been moved online, and Gia didn't like doing all of her work in the house. She felt trapped. And so her routine consisted of getting up early and heading to Bellevue College, which is just outside of Seattle, where she could do some work in their library, do her online courses there, and then come back sometime in the evening. And so Gia's parents assumed that's what she was doing that day. But when Gia left that morning, she did not follow her typical COVID-19 routine of going to Bellevue College to do schoolwork. Instead, she hopped on the highway and she drove 60 miles to a very rural part of Washington state. It's very heavily forested. It's called Index, Washington. And she gets picked up on a camera inside of a coffee shop where she gets a cup of coffee and she buys a Bigfoot keychain and then gets back in her car and drives another 30 miles away from Seattle, away from her parents' home. It's unclear where she's going until her car runs out of gas. And when she ran out of gas, it was like she wasn't prepared for it because she was only able to turn her car and barely pull off of Highway 2. It didn't look like she'd intentionally parked. And it's actually how investigators spotted it because it was jutting out into the road slightly. She gets out, and instead of walking on the highway to try to get help or trying to flag down another motorist, she grabs her cell phone, her Bible, and a journal and turns and starts walking directly uphill. There's like this mountain right next to the highway, and it's very densely forested. And she just starts walking straight up this mountain. It's important to note that David Paulides just recently came out with a video about this case on his Can-Am Missing Project channel. And he says that the area she stopped in is an area where at least a dozen other people have gone missing under baffling circumstances that have all been covered in the Missing 411 phenomenon. By 11:30 that night, Gia's parents were starting to get very concerned that they hadn't heard from their daughter and that she hadn't come home yet. They started texting her and calling her. No answer, no response. By 1 a.m., they called the police. So this huge search is launched to go find Gia. Hundreds of volunteers, they have all these professional search and rescue people out there, they have helicopters overhead, and almost immediately, within a few hours of the search being launched, they find her car on Highway 2. But no sign of her anywhere. The area that she was in was actually a dead zone for cell phone service, so they couldn't get in touch with her in part because they had no service, and authorities weren't able to track her phone because there was no cell phone reception. So they didn't have much to work with except that they generally knew where she might be, which is in this very thick section of the Cascade Mountains. And so for days and days, they're searching and turning up nothing. And unfortunately, as time ticks on, the likelihood of her being found alive is next to zero. But 7 days into this huge search where nothing has been turned up, they have this huge find. A couple of the searchers that were miles away from where she had gone missing. I mean, at this point, you're 7 days into the search. You have searchers combing miles and miles of territory, and there's nothing. They've found nothing. And these searchers are up near this scenic creek, where there's a little bit of a clearing, there's this creek, and they find in one area her jacket, her shoes, her phone, her journal, and her Bible, all in one area. It looked like she had just suddenly stripped everything she had, put it on the ground, but she was nowhere to be found. So while this find is certainly great progress towards discovering what happened, it unfortunately sent a message to her parents that at this point, you need to brace for the worst, because now your daughter is not only missing and has been for a week, she doesn't have any gear. She has no clothes, she has no phone, she's just gone and has nothing. So the omen was very bad at this point. But her family and the searchers were not willing to give up, so they continued to search this new area where all of her stuff had been found for another 2 days. And on the 9th day from when she had gone missing, they found her, and she was alive. She was sitting on a rock near this creek. When they approached her, she was very startled to see people coming near her. She clearly was not expecting to be found. She was also more or less incoherent. She believed she had only been out for maybe 3 days and just had gotten lost, but they told her she had been gone for 9 days. But she was unhurt. She had a couple scratches on her. She was definitely emaciated, but she had been drinking from the stream and eating huckleberries. So she was, taking care of herself, but she was totally confused. She didn't know why she was there. And when she was pressed a little bit further, she didn't know why she drove where she drove. She doesn't know why she walked up a very steep mountain into the Cascades. She also has no idea what happened over the first 6-7 days. She only recalled the last couple and thought that's the whole time she had been out there. So it's a very confusing story, and one that probably we will never get a clear answer to. This will just become another one of the thousands of very odd disappearances that occur all over North America, except at least in this case, she was found alive. Tom Mezek was this salty Army veteran. He had served in the 82nd Airborne Division, which is an elite paratrooper division. He taught survival training classes, but more than anything, he loved to hunt. And he actually hunted in this one particular area in New York all the time with the same group of friends. In fact, for like 55 years, Tom and his 6 hunter friends would hunt this one area. On November 15th, 2015, Tom and his hunting buddies decide to go hunt in this area. And they got a bit of a late start. They didn't get out there till about noon. So they decided, in order to make up for lost time, to use this technique that's referred to as a deer drive, where you have stationary watchers that set up on a line about 100 meters apart from one another, and you have a group of drivers that kind of corral any deer or any animals in the area and push them so that they go past the watchers who can take a shot at those animals. And so Tom, along with 3 other hunters, were made watchers, and they set up along this hillside where Tom was all the way on the left flank, which meant on his left were no hunters. He did have a hunter 100 meters to his right, and then there was 2 other hunters all the way up the hill on the right as well, but he was on the outer flank of that line. And the 3 other hunters that were going to be doing the driving were to his right as well. Behind this hill, they were going to try to push the deer up and over this hill down to this line of watchers. After 3 hours and no luck, they haven't seen one deer, they start to also comment on the fact that there doesn't seem to be any wildlife at all. No squirrels, no birds, no anything. There's just silence, which is very odd for this area. And when you consider that this group has hunted this area for 55 years, they have a really good understanding of what normal looks like. And before anything happened with Tom, they were already talking about how strange that was. Also, one of the watchers who was right next to where Tom was, about 100 meters away, he recalled hearing a very distinct sound, like a whooshing sound or a snapping sound, coming generally from where Tom was. But he didn't think much of it at the time. That is, until they got back to their cars after calling off the hunt because they had been unsuccessful, and everyone's there except for Tom. And they go back out, they're yelling for Tom, they're wondering, did he fall down? They're like, okay, let's radio him, because everybody had radios. There's no answer from Tom. They're searching the area where he was. They start shooting their rifles into the air. They can't find him, and they think, okay, well, we don't know what he's doing, but this guy is super competent. He was healthy. Let's just go to the cars and wait for him. And so they're sitting at the parking lot, which is not very far from where they were hunting. And this is an area they always parked in, and this is an area they always hunted in. So they knew that Tom knows where they're gonna be. And so they sat there waiting, and he's just not showing up. So eventually, the hunters call it in to the rangers that he's gone missing. A massive search is launched for Tom. I mean, they are combing this area. They got helicopters, professional search teams. They're looking in lakes, they're looking under logs, they're looking everywhere, and there's not a shred of evidence of Tom. They can't find his walkie-talkie, they can't find his gun, there's no clothes, there's nothing. He's just disappeared. On the 4th day of the search, the FBI shows up, and they get involved in the search, which didn't make any sense, because why is the FBI getting involved 4 days into a search for an elderly hunter where there's no sign of foul play? Why are they getting involved? It didn't really add up. And all they would tell Tom's wife is that they believed that something was off about this case, and that's why they were there. But they couldn't elaborate unless more information came in. But nothing ever shows up. Even though Tom was a bit older, he literally taught survival classes. He was the guy teaching other people how to survive in the woods. He also has been hunting in that particular area for 55 years. How is it that he in no way was able to signal that something was wrong, and that all these people, including the FBI, can't find any trace of him? It just seems like something is off. I gotta agree with the FBI on this one. In 2013, 51-year-old Dale Stelling decided to take a trip from Texas, where he lived with his wife and his parents, up to Colorado. He was an avid outdoorsman, and he had always wanted to go hiking and camping in Colorado. So he, his wife, and his parents load up the RV and they start making their way up to Colorado. On June 9th, as they're making their way to Colorado, their RV breaks down in New Mexico. Even though they were eager to get to Colorado, Dale saw that where they had broken down was near the Mesa Verde National Park, and he thought, well, we weren't planning this, but let's just stay here for a night and go check out the park tomorrow. Then we'll get the RV fixed and we'll be on our way to Colorado. And so they all agree, they stay the night, and the next morning they head over to Mesa Verde National Park. It was a very hot day that day, and Dale's wife was overweight and not very healthy, and his parents were very elderly. So when they got to the park, they ended up just sitting at the visitor center, and no one really wanted to actually go walk around. But Dale was an avid hiker, and he didn't like the idea of just sitting around all day. And so at some point, Dale just says, hey, I'm gonna go stretch my legs and walk this trail here down to the abandoned city ruins. There was this city that had been built into the cliff that lots of tourists would go check out. And so his wife and his parents, they don't bat an eye. They say, okay, we'll see you in a little bit. And Dale was off. Dale made it seem like it was going to be a very quick trip. And so when he didn't return in 2 hours, his family decided to tell rangers and say, hey, you know, our husband, our son, he went hiking down that trail there towards the ruins and we haven't heard from him. We can't get in touch with him on the phone. You know, can you guys go look for him? The rangers actually were not concerned at all. They said that we've never had anybody go missing for more than a few hours here. It's pretty hard to get lost. You know, there's lots of tourists here, well-marked trails. Just give it a couple more hours, and if he doesn't show up, then we'll go out and look for him. But after about an hour, and they still hadn't seen him, his family really pressed the issue with the rangers, and they would go looking for Dale. And of course, they can't find him, but they found a number of tourists that had seen him on the trail that he said he was going to be on. They had even talked to him. He was a very energetic, charismatic guy, and they would say that he seemed like he was just another tourist enjoying his time at the park. There's nothing odd about his behavior at all. And he was walking towards the area where he had told his family he was going. While that information was certainly useful, they still couldn't find Dale. And they were really fighting against the elements on this one. You know, the temperatures were over 100 degrees Fahrenheit and had been all day, and Dale didn't have any water. So they really had a limited amount of time to find him. So within 24 hours, there's this huge search that's launched for Dale. And interestingly, in the first 24 hours of the search, a woman was at the park and was walking along the trail that Dale was on. And she remembers hearing a weak male voice yelling for help. And so she kind of looked over the edge. She couldn't see down below her. She was on a bit of a cliff. Fearing that if she went to look, she might fall and become a victim, she went back to the rangers and said, hey, here's the area I was in. I heard someone yelling for help. You should go check it out. And the rangers said that actually we've been getting that report. We got that report yesterday. But when we went to look in that area, we can't find anything. There's no one over there. So while it seems very likely that that person calling for help was most likely Dale, we don't know for sure because they were never able to locate who was asking for help. And to this day, we have no idea where Dale is. There's been no shred of evidence to indicate where he went. He just vanished. If you enjoyed today's story, if you haven't already, please sneak into the like button's house and replace all of their salt shakers with sugar. Also, please subscribe to my channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of my weekly uploads. So I'd love to get your reaction to these 3 stories. What do you think happened and why? And I'll do my best to get back to as many of you as I possibly can. If you're interested in learning more about the missing 411 phenomenon as documented by David Paulides, then you should check out David Paulides and his team at their YouTube channel, the Can-Am Missing Project. I've also provided links in the description below to all of their work. Also, I have a Missing 411 playlist that you can save and watch that as well. If you have a story suggestion for me to use on this channel, go to our subreddit, which is just MrBallen. It's linked below. It's a place where you can drop your story suggestions. And if I intentionally use your suggestion, I will absolutely credit you. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram. My username is John. In 2014, Aaron Hedges was 38 years old, he lived in Montana, and he was an avid hunter. During the hunting season, Aaron was known to spend almost every weekend or every other weekend hunting in one particular area known as the Crazy Mountains, or the Crazies for short. The Crazies are a mountain range in Montana that are actually disconnected from the Rocky Mountains. So they're very isolated, and they're beautiful, but they're incredibly rugged and very steep. Aaron knew this area like the back of his hand because he was there all the time hunting. In fact, he was there so often that he began placing caches of sleeping bags, food, water. He cached this all over the crazies. And he knew how to get to his cache points without the use of a map. He just could look around and know where he was, and he could walk to his cache point. On September 3rd, 2014, Aaron, along with two of his close friends, decided to go on a hunting trip to the crazies for a week. They planned on staying right next to this lake called Campfire Lake, but in order to get to it, they had to hike into the crazies. You could not drive a car to where they were going to stay. So they got 2 horses and a pack mule, and Aaron loaded much of his gear onto the pack mule. And so they begin this hike up to Campfire Lake. And a little ways into this first day hike, the mule spooks at something and runs away. In the process of running away from them, it ditched all of their equipment all over the place, and they couldn't recover it all. Now, after they gathered up what they could and got the mule back and continued their walk, Aaron decided he didn't feel like going to one of his cache points to try to retrieve an extra sleeping bag, and he said, I'm just gonna use whatever extra gear you guys have, I'll make do. And so they continue on, they get to Campfire Lake, and they set up their camp, and for the first couple of days, everything is going just fine. On the 3rd day, Aaron decided that, you know what, I could tough it out, but I'm just gonna go north to one of my cache points and get that extra sleeping bag and try to get a few other things that were lost and make my living arrangements a little bit more comfortable while I'm here. And so his 2 buddies, they know that Aaron is in this section of the crazies all the time. And so they didn't bat an eye when he says he's gonna go off on his own. It wasn't a very far distance to this cache point. They said, okay, we'll see you later tonight. So Aaron takes off, and after a little while, one of his buddies, for whatever reason, uses his radio to reach out to Aaron. The walkie-talkies they were using had this LED screen that anytime you transmitted traffic on it, it would register your GPS location and transmit that to the person you're talking to. So when he hailed Aaron at about 10 in the morning after he had left to go up to his cache point, when Aaron radioed back, it showed up on their LED screen that instead of going north to this cache point, he had deviated and gone very far to the east. And he would say on the radio, Aaron would say back to them, hey guys, I got mixed up and I missed the turn to go up to the cache point. I'm trying to find the trail to get back to the cache point. But they expect him, based on what he said, that he was just going to turn and go to the cache point and come back to where they were at some point that night. But here's the first weird thing about this case. Aaron got turned around and basically missed the turn at this really obvious fork in the trail. If you go this way, you'll get to your cache. If you go this way, you'll end up where Aaron is, and it's the complete wrong way. And you know it's the wrong way because on your right-hand side, if you're going this way, there's going to be a creek on your right. Whereas if you go towards the cache, you're going uphill and there's no creek. So for Aaron, in perfect weather conditions, to have missed a very obvious fork in the road that he knows well is a little bit strange. Not to mention where he showed up on their GPS when they talked to him on the radio, he was a ways down the wrong direction. He would have been next to that creek for long enough that he should have already turned around. It's like making a wrong turn and going 45 minutes to an hour in the wrong direction when you already know it's the wrong direction. Why are you still going that way? But his friends were not that concerned. They had just spoken to him on the radio. He's saying, I got turned around. They're expecting him now to show up a little bit later in the day, maybe in the evening at some point. So that night when he doesn't show up, they try radioing him and they can't get through to him. And they decide that, you know what, it's not that easy to call authorities. They didn't have cell reception out there, and it would have been about a day's hike before they could even get to a place where they could call authorities. So they decide, let's just stay here tonight. He could show up at any point in the middle of the night, and tomorrow, if he's not here, we'll go looking for him. The next morning, his friends get up. This is on September 6th. There's no Aaron. So they head off in the direction of this cache and they start looking for Aaron. And all day they're calling for him. They're trying to radio him. Nothing, no sign of him. The following morning on the 7th, they do leave the area. They give up on their hunting trip and they head out of the crazies to contact authorities. Authorities launch this massive search for Aaron. But as soon as they launch this search, this massive storm rolls in, dumping 2 feet of snow within the first 12 hours of their search. So they really weren't able to accomplish much in those first 2 days, which brings us to September 9th. One of the main areas that they were looking for Aaron was following that path that he had gone down, the wrong path away from his cache. They followed that path down along that creek and were looking for anywhere along the creek that he might have been. And there was this cliff that overlooked the creek, and on this cliff, next to a tree, they found Aaron's boots, neatly placed side by side as if put there intentionally. Next to his boots was a very obvious fire pit where someone had started a fire. In the fire pit was a cigarette container that was Aaron's brand. It looks every bit like Aaron had been here, smoked a cigarette, took his boots off for some reason, and had been sitting next to this fire. Also next to the fire was Aaron's Camelback water bladder, as well as some of the straps that went to his backpack that had been burned inside of the fire pit. But there's no sign of Aaron or his remains anywhere near there. Also, the people who found the boots in the fire said that we were in this specific area over the past 2 days. This wasn't here. At this point, investigators believed that Aaron must have been suffering from severe hypothermia, where in severe cases, people are known to actually strip their clothing. And so searchers created a new search area based on his boots, thinking he had to have been at this fire pit smoking a cigarette. He took his boots off because he's got hypothermia, and he wandered off, but he can't have gotten far. We're talking 2 feet of snow on the ground in rugged terrain, and he's barefoot. But despite searching extensively in their new search area, they couldn't find Aaron or any sign of him. 9 months later, a family, the Rhines family, who lived near the base of the crazy mountain range, they were doing their yearly maintenance on their fence that went around their entire property. And one of the family members decided to take a break from the work and walk up into the crazies just a little ways up to just sit on the mountain and look out across the land. It was a beautiful view. And as he's walking up, he gets about a mile from the property itself, and he spots an orange vest under a tree. And so he figures a hunter must have lost their gear. So he walks up and he sees that not only is there an orange hunting vest laying on the ground, but there is a backpack that would turn out to be Aaron Hedges' backpack leaning up against a tree, as if placed there on purpose. Inside of the pack was Aaron Hedges' wallet and license, along with a loaded gun and food and water. Next to the pack, there was this rock. And on the rock was a thermos that was open, along with an open energy drink. As if Aaron had set his pack down and then sat on this rock and was sipping an energy drink out of his thermos. If Aaron had been sitting on that rock, as it appears he was, you can clearly see the Rhines property a mile away from you. It's right in front of you. It would be impossible not to see. Additionally, this location was 6 miles away from where Aaron's boots were found. So all of Aaron's gear is brought to the authorities, who go out and they look for Aaron, and there's no sign of Aaron in the area. Another year would go by and a couple of horseback riders would be riding past that same area where the backpack was found, and they see a human skull sitting underneath a tree. Sure enough, it winds up being Aaron Hedges' skull, and his skeletal remains were all there, except for his feet. His feet were never found, but the coroner could not determine a cause of death. So a couple of questions come to mind. How did Aaron, a guy that knows the crazies inside and out, make that wrong turn in the first place? He should have known better. But even if we say he got turned around, it can happen to the best of us, he would have known he was going in the wrong direction because the creek would be on his right, but he kept going because we find his campsite with his boots way down the path that was in the wrong direction. But even if we're willing to accept that as why he was at that campsite, he took off his boots. And then he walked 6 miles in 2 feet of snow to a location that was literally looking at safety. The Rhines property is right there. You have food, you have water, and you're sitting there drinking a drink. You have a loaded gun, you can fire it into the air to try to get someone's attention, but you don't use your resources, you don't go to safety, you die. In 2018, Terrence Woods was a 27-year-old filmmaker slash journalist who had, ever since graduating college, traveled the world filming in locations that are very rugged and sometimes quite dangerous for these documentaries and TV shows that he was known to work on. In October of that year, Terrence was going to travel to Idaho with a production company called Raw TV. They were doing a TV series around an abandoned gold mine called the Penman Mine. Penman Mine was located in an area that is quite rugged in the middle of the backcountry. Terrence had previously worked on 2 different backcountry shoots. One was done in Turkey and the other was done in Alaska. So he wasn't an expert by any means, but he was accustomed to being out in the wilderness to do some of these shoots. Prior to leaving for the trip, he had texted a number of his friends and just said he wasn't really that excited about going on the trip. His friends would later say to investigators that his language was not alarming. He was just kind of complaining about not wanting to go on a particular work trip, so it didn't stand out to them at all. Terrence arrives in Idaho in early October. He texts his father to let him know that he's landed, he's made it to the hotel. everything seems to be going normally. He was supposed to be there until mid-November, and that's what everybody in his circle was expecting. So on October 5th, when Terrence sent a text to his father that just said, "I'm going to be coming home on October 10th," and there was no explanation, his father wondered why. And so he wrote a response and said, "Why are you cutting your trip short?" But he never got a response because Terrence had actually already left for the day on October 5th to go do a shoot at this mine, and he'd be out of cell phone reception. On October 5th, the crew that was around Terrence all day reported that he was acting very strangely. He was very quiet, withdrawn, wasn't really talking to anybody. And at the end of the day, when they were wrapping up shooting, one of the producers was sitting in a vehicle waiting for everyone to kind of finish up, packing up, and Terrence said he wanted to go relieve himself. And he walked over to the edge of this cliff, and for whatever reason, this producer, he didn't know why, but he just thought he needed to look to see if Terrence was okay. And he turns to look where Terrence was standing at the edge of this cliff, and Terrence isn't there anymore. And he sees Terrence's radio is now sitting on the ground, standing there. And there was just something about the scene that he saw that he instinctively knew something's wrong, and he actually ran up the cliff in case Terrence had fallen off of it. But when he got to the edge of the cliff and looked over, he was shocked to see that Terrence was down there, about 15 feet down, but wasn't laying on the ground like he had fallen. He was sprinting down the hill, not saying a word, not looking up, running at full speed down the hill into the forest. The producer didn't know what to do. He kind of yelled to some other people and said, "Hey, what's Terrence doing?" No one knew. And so the producer and somebody else also began chasing after Terrence. But after a little while, they couldn't catch up to him, and they were worried that by chasing after him, they might scare him. And so instead, they immediately go and they call authorities, and this huge search is launched for Terrence. So for a week, you have all these people looking for Terrence. You have people on foot, you have dog teams, you have a helicopter with infrared technology. You have all these people combing this area, and there's no sign of Terrence. One of the search and rescue officers commented that it would have been so hard to get away from this search because the ground inside of that forest was so covered with fallen trees that there were times where you were just walking on fallen trees. You weren't even touching the ground. And so the idea that Terrence could run in there and effectively evade this massive search that had kind of encircled the area, it just didn't make any sense. But there was just no trace of him. And to this day, we have no idea where he went. There's never been a sign of what happened to Terrence. He just started running away for reasons we don't understand and disappeared. On the same day that Terrence Woods goes missing, 56 miles away in the same mountain range, a 76-year-old woman named Connie Johnson also goes missing under very strange circumstances. Connie was an outdoors woman through and through. She had previously worked as a wilderness ranger for the U.S. Forest Service, and she was known to take young people out on trips along the backcountry and teach them how to survive. Her friends said that she had tremendous survival skills and spent much of her time alone in the woods. Connie was working as a camp cook for Ritchie Outfitters. It was a company that organized hunting trips in the Idaho and Montana backcountry. The camp that she was actually working at was not accessible by vehicle. You had to get there on foot or on horseback. On October 2nd, all of the hunters at the Ritchie Outfitters camp that she was working in left for a 3-day hunting trip. They said bye to her and bye to her dog Ace, and they were gone. She was the only person at the camp. The following day, they got a very strange radio transmission from Connie. They couldn't understand what she was saying. They couldn't tell if she was mumbling or if there was something wrong, or maybe it could have been the radio. But when no one could understand what she was saying, they ultimately said, "Okay, I'm sure she's fine." And so a couple days go by, and on October 5th, the hunting party returns to the cabin, and Connie's gone, as well as her dog Ace. They're both gone. All they could find was Connie's jacket was laying over her gun that was sitting on a picnic table. That was it. A very intense search was launched that included the National Guard, the Air Force, helicopters, dog teams, ground searchers. They couldn't find her or her dog. And so on October 16th, they called off the search. 3 weeks later, Ace, her dog, would show up 15 miles away from where they had gone missing. The dog was emaciated, but was okay. They fed the dog, and then they tried to get the dog to help them find Connie, but to no avail. To this day, we have no idea where Connie went or why she left the camp to begin with. In February of 2008, the Pilkington family, which was David and Camilla, along with their two sons, Timothy and William, who was 7 years old, were on vacation on the west coast of Vancouver Island. They were staying in this tiny little town called Tofino, which was at the end of one of the peninsulas on the island. There was maybe 20 streets in the town. There was only a handful of places that you could stay. Everybody knew everybody on the island. I mean, it was really a tiny place. One morning, David wakes up early and decides he wants to take both of his sons down to one of Tofino's beaches. And so he gets Timothy and William, they walk over and they go down this flight of steps that leads down onto the beach itself. And when they get to the bottom of the steps, William says he wants to stay at the foot of the stairs. Timothy wants to go actually walk around the beach with David. And so David couldn't convince William to come with him and with Timothy. And so he says, okay, William, you stay right here. I'm gonna go with Timothy for a couple of minutes and walk around the beach. So David and Timothy walked only about 10 or 15 meters away from William, who was just standing at the foot of the stairs, just watching his dad and his brother. And at some point, David would say that he turned his back on his son. He said it was maybe for a minute. And he was looking at Timothy and they were doing whatever they were doing. And then when he turned around, William wasn't there anymore. And so David instinctively runs over because there's nobody else down there. There's nowhere really for him to have gone. But he runs over, he's looking on the sides of the stairs. He can't find his son. You know, he's looking where he could have gone, and it only made sense for him to probably go up the stairs. It wouldn't have been long enough for him to get into the water. It had only been about a minute he had turned his back. And so he goes up the stairs, he's looking around, he can't find his son. And this huge search is launched for this boy because this just happened. It's a very small area. They figure they can find this kid. The main area they were going to look was inside of the forest. Tofino had a very dense forest right in the middle of it. And since the beach butted up against the forest, they figured that the boy could have walked up the stairs and made it into the forest in that 1 minute that his father's back was turned. And so after an exhaustive search of this forest and there's no sign of him, unfortunately investigators began to look to the beach and were waiting for a body to wash up on shore because historically the only people that ever went missing in Tofino were either found in the forest or they washed up on the beach. Those are the only two places you can go. There isn't anywhere else you can go. But the boy never washed up on a beach and they never found a shred of evidence ever in the forest where that boy was. He just vanished. So unfortunately, like basically all of the missing 411 cases, you have a baffling set of circumstances with no clear resolution. We don't know what happened to these people, and we probably never will. But that doesn't stop us from theorizing about what could have happened, so I'd love to hear in the comments, and I'll get back to as many of you as I possibly can. If you want to learn more about Missing 411, I do have a playlist just called Missing 411. Or what I would suggest is going right to the source. Check out David Paulides and his book series called Missing 411. I provided links below of how to get his books. I've also provided his YouTube channel in the description as well. So please go check out David Paulides and his team at Can-Am Missing Project. They're amazing, and it's why we have any of this information to begin with. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, I would ask you to politely take an M67 frag grenade, pull the pin, and gently lob it towards the like button. Also, please subscribe to my channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of my weekly uploads. If you have a story suggestion, we have a subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. I check it every single day, and if I intentionally use your story suggestion, I will absolutely credit you. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram. My username is JohnBallen4.
41-year-old Victor Gunnarsson looked out the window of his small apartment in Salisbury, North Carolina. It was Wednesday afternoon, December 1st, 1993, and another mild winter had settled over the Tar Heel state. Even though Victor had lived in America now for almost 8 years, the onset of what passed for cold in this part of the world still brought back sharp memories of the country where Victor was born and where he had expected, at one time, to spend his entire life. If Victor were waking up today in Sweden, 4,500 miles to the north and east of where he stood right now, he'd be welcoming the start of the coldest month of the year, with freezing temperatures that were nearly 20 degrees lower on average than where he lived now, and days so short that the sun would be setting by 3 p.m. in the afternoon. In Sweden, Victor would be piling on wool sweaters and overcoats. Here in Salisbury, he hardly ever had to wear anything warmer than his leather bomber jacket. Turning away from the window, Victor gave himself a small mental shrug. He felt lucky that he didn't miss his homeland more than he did, because for Victor, leaving Sweden had been a matter of necessity, not choice. Back in 1986, Victor's big talk about his anti-communist views, along with his right-wing activism, had gotten him in so much trouble that he'd basically been driven out of his politically liberal homeland. And even if he went back to Sweden's capital city of Stockholm, where he used to live, Victor knew he would not be any more welcome now than he had been 8 years earlier. What still surprised the tall, handsome Swede with the dark hair and intense blue eyes was that he finally felt okay about all of that. When he'd had to leave Stockholm, he'd chosen the US because he'd enjoyed the time he'd once spent vacationing in sunny California, but he'd wound up settling not on the West Coast, but here in central North Carolina, where the weather was warm, cost of living was reasonable, and where the beautiful Blue Ridge Mountains were within a day's drive of the Lakewood apartment complex that Victor now called home. And here in the south of the United States, Victor's conservative views didn't raise so many eyebrows, and his naturally gregarious personality had meshed seamlessly with the region's legendary southern hospitality and friendliness. And it hadn't taken Victor long since he'd arrived before he'd put his ability to speak 9 different languages to good use. Within weeks of getting settled here and advertising his services as a language tutor, Victor began to get so many requests for help that he'd had to start putting prospective students on a waiting list. Now, earning $50 an hour, which would be the equivalent of about $100 today, Victor wasn't rich, but he did feel financially comfortable. Victor had also very quickly found his niche in Salisbury as a ladies' man. From the second he had arrived, Victor made no bones about how much he enjoyed female company in every size, shape, and age. And even after the short but passionate affairs that Victor favored ended, he almost always remained on very friendly terms with his former lovers. The South was also a place where Victor, who liked to exaggerate when it came to describing his life experiences, found a willing audience. In addition to his magnetic personality, the fact that he was from Sweden and spoke so many languages gave him an exotic and cosmopolitan gloss that women and men found very interesting. Now, opening up one of the kitchen drawers and picking out a sharp paring knife, Victor thought about the latest woman in his life and smiled. Reaching for the fresh tomatoes that were piled on the counter in front of him, he put one of them on the cutting board and then looked down at his gold watch to check the time. Just 5 days ago, on the Friday after Thanksgiving, Victor had met a local high school teacher named Kay Whedon, who was housing a foreign exchange student from Denmark. And the attraction between Victor and Kay, who was 40 years old and, like Victor, divorced, had been immediate and very strong. The two of them had been brought together by a mutual friend who had told Kay that Kay's exchange student, Mikkel, who was there attending the local high school, might enjoy talking in his native language with Victor. Since that first meeting, Victor and Kay had spent a few more evenings with one another, and while their relationship was still purely platonic, Kay had asked Victor over to her house for dinner tonight so he could meet Mikkel and also Kay's 15-year-old only child, a son named Jason. Victor had been thrilled, and he'd told Kay not to worry about cooking, that he would provide the food, spaghetti with the homemade sauce he was now in the process of making. And if all went well, Victor thought, as he moved through the steps of a pasta recipe he knew by heart, maybe he and Kay, a smart and attractive woman who taught high school English and drama, would become more than just friends. On Friday, December 3rd, Victor got his wish. Victor's homemade spaghetti dinner 2 evenings earlier had been such a success that Kay was eager to move their relationship forward. Victor had hit it off right away with both Mikkel and Jason, and now Kay wanted Victor to meet one of the most important people in Kay's life, Kay's 77-year-old mother, Catherine Miller. Even though she was 12 years past retirement age, Catherine was still working hard as an accounts clerk at W.A. Brown, an industrial refrigeration company that had been a local fixture in Salisbury for more than 80 years. Now a widow, Catherine devoted her spare time to church and volunteer activities and to playing a very big role in the lives of her grandson Jason and her only daughter Kay. And ever since Kay had moved to Salisbury after her divorce 6 years ago, Catherine had kept a very protective and, lately, a very worried eye on her daughter's love life. Catherine had heard all about an earlier date Kay had gone on back in November with a man named David Sumner, who Kay had met through a, quote, reputable dating agency, end quote. Their first get-together at a local lunch spot was promising, but the dinner date that followed a few days later had turned out to be a disaster. So when Kay had started talking about this intelligent and good-looking man named Victor, who was so different from Kay's expectation that a Swede would be pale-skinned and blonde, Catherine was very interested in meeting the new person in Kay's life. And when Kay had asked Catherine to join Kay and Victor at the Blue Bay Seafood Restaurant that night of December 3rd, Catherine hadn't hesitated even a second before saying yes. And now, as the three of them sat at a table for four near a window at Blue Bay and placed their dinner orders, Catherine thought that overall, Victor seemed friendly and courteous. He was definitely a talker, except when it came to exactly why he had left his home in Sweden's capital city of Stockholm 8 years earlier. But then again, Catherine thought to herself, everyone had their secrets, and Catherine wondered how much Kay had told Victor about the problems that Kay had been having in her own life. It wasn't until the end of the meal, when Victor took his last bite of his baked potato and motioned to the server that he was ready for the check, that dinner hit one small sour note. That was when Victor took the money that Catherine had offered to him to cover the cost of her own meal, but instead of giving Catherine any change or refusing Catherine's offer, Victor used Catherine's money to pay the entire tab. And the only contribution he made was to take a few dollars from his pocket and tuck them under his plate for the tip. A few minutes later, as Catherine, Victor, and Kay stood up and put on their coats before heading out the door and into the cool night air to the parking lot, Kay, who had also noticed this telltale sign that Victor was very likely tight with money, gave her mother an embarrassed shrug. Maybe, Catherine thought, as Victor held the car door of Kay's car open for Catherine to slide in before he stepped away to get into his own car to drive back to Lakewood Apartments where he lived, Victor didn't hate the welfare state, which is how he described Sweden, quite as much as he said he did, because he certainly didn't mind taking from the person who was supposed to be his guest. But later that night, when Kay and Victor were sitting outside in Kay's yard next to the fire pit, Kay at least had put that single awkward moment at the restaurant out of her mind. After dropping her mother off at 118 Larch Road and reminding her mom to make sure her alarm system was on for the night, Kay had headed back to her own house to wait for Victor, who had wanted to go to his own apartment and change into more comfortable clothing before coming back to join Kay. When Victor arrived at Sycamore Road, Jason and Mikkel were out with friends, which meant Kay and Victor had 3 hours alone together. When Jason and Mikkel got back to the house at about 10 p.m., Kay and Victor joined the teens and a few of their friends out in the side yard to enjoy a fire in the fire pit. Now, as Kay and Victor sat next to one another, their fingers entwined, Kay noticed the glint of a small diamond set in the heavy gold signet ring that Victor always wore on his left hand. When Kay asked about the ring, Victor took it off and told her that the 3 letters engraved around the diamond meant strength and courage. As their eyes met over the ring, Kay's heart skipped a beat, especially after the hours that she and Victor had just spent alone. Kay hoped that there would be many more evenings just like this in the months ahead. Those thoughts were interrupted a few minutes later when Kay was startled by the sight of a car pulling into the end of her driveway. But a moment later, when she saw the car was just using her driveway to turn around and head back the way it had just come, she forced her shoulders to relax. An hour later, at about 11:15, Victor gave Kay's hand a gentle squeeze, then leaned over and told her that it was time for him to go back to his own apartment. And 10 minutes after that, while Jason and his friends were still enjoying the fire, Kay was standing just inside the front door of the house saying goodnight to Victor. After a long kiss, Victor stepped back, smiled, and promised Kay he would call her the next day. Then, as Kay watched, the big man with black hair and intense blue eyes shoved his hands deep into his pockets, walked down the porch steps, and back to his car. 35 days later, and 100 miles northwest of Salisbury, a land surveyor working with a North Carolina state highway crew up in Watauga County was picking his way through the dense woods off Highway 421, near the summit of one of the Blue Ridge Mountains. The highway department service vehicles were parked about 300 yards away alongside the edge of an entrance ramp leading onto the Blue Ridge Parkway, a scenic route through the mountain range that was closed at the moment due to uncleared ice and snow. As soon as the surveyor had stepped out of the warm vehicle, the cold mountain air and wind hit him like a fist, but after just a few steps, he had entered the relative shelter of thick trees. As he moved through the snow, the man's eyes swept back and forth across the ground just ahead of him. He didn't want to take any chances that he might miss the iron property marker he was looking for. After making his way around a large clump of mountain laurel, the surveyor stopped for a second to look up and take stock of his surroundings. Directly in front of him was a huge pine tree that had fallen or been knocked over by the wind. Facing the surveyor were the upended and snow-covered roots of the tree. And in the indentation in the earth where all those roots had once dug into the ground, the surveyor suddenly noticed something out of place in the snow just a few steps in front of him. The surveyor squinted, sure that his eyes were playing tricks on him. Then, moving much more slowly now, the man took one more step closer and then froze. Sticking out of the white snow immediately in front of the surveyor were two bare human feet. The toes and flesh of one foot had been chewed down to the bone by small animals, but the big toe on the left foot, large with a bristle of black hairs, a man's foot, was still intact. Suddenly gagging, the surveyor stumbled backward, then turned and ran a few yards back along the path he had just made through the snow. Then, pausing to catch his breath and looking over his shoulder again at the fallen pine tree, he dropped his case of equipment into the snow, opened his mouth, and yelled for help. By 2 p.m., the entrance ramp to the Blue Ridge Parkway was crowded with law enforcement vehicles and personnel. In response to the 911 call that had come in a few minutes earlier from the state highway crew reporting that what appeared to be a man's dead body had been found in the woods, 2 patrol cars from the Watauga County Sheriff's Department had been first on the scene, where they were soon joined by members of the Blue Ridge National Park Service. By the time Detective Sergeant Paula May from the Division of Criminal Investigations in the Watauga Sheriff's Department had arrived, the area around the fallen pine tree was taped off, and the surveyor, who had discovered the body under a mound of snow in the shadow of the upended tree roots, couldn't wait to give his statement to police, and then get out of the woods and back into a warm car as fast as possible. Detective May couldn't blame him. The temperature, already well below freezing, was dropping steadily. And this was only the beginning of what the 6-year veteran with the Sheriff's Department knew would be a very long and very cold night. But in this case, the investigator also knew that in this situation, the cold and snow might work to the advantage of law enforcement. The large body that was clearly buried, except for the feet, under a mound of snow near the fallen pine tree had probably been well preserved by the recent cold temperatures. And if decomposition had been minimal, then the body might yield valuable clues about the identity of this person, along with the cause and time of their death. But aside from her assumption, based on the feet and the size of the body under the snow, that the victim was a man, the fact that the victim appeared to be naked raised more questions than answers. It basically ruled out 2 of the more common causes of death out here in the woods, suicide or an accident. And that left the third option, that what she was looking at here was likely a homicide. And that would open the door to a very complicated investigation because murders could be committed for all kinds of reasons and by all kinds of people. And unless police found the man's clothing and some form of ID, there was also the challenge of finding out who this victim was. Detective May knew at the moment there were no active reports of missing people in Watauga County. And even before she left the woods later that evening, she also knew that one of her first tasks would be to check on missing person reports outside of the county, both in the larger region and statewide. Within a few hours of Detective May's arrival, the Watauga County Sheriff had already made a call to the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation asking for help. And not long after that, the area around the snow-covered body began to fill with members of a state crime tech unit and an agent assigned to work closely with Detective May. It wasn't until after the scene was photographed, sketched, and processed that the medical examiner oversaw the removal of the body. And after one small scoop of snow at a time had been lifted off the corpse, investigators finally got their first look at the nude adult white male who lay underneath the mound of snow. The bare skin of the man's back was frozen to the ground. His wide open mouth showed a set of straight white teeth. In his left temple, just below the line of dark hair that still covered what was left of his scalp, investigators could see a clearly defined circle where a bullet had been fired into his skull. And on the right side of the man's neck, there was a second bullet hole. There was no sign anywhere of the man's clothes, and no shell casings from the rounds that were fired. But the body was not completely stripped. On the man's left wrist was a gold watch, and on his left hand, he wore a heavy gold signet ring with a small center diamond. The only other physical item left at the scene of what investigators now knew had to have been a murder was a 16-inch long strip of electrical and masking tape. The same kind of tape that investigators would later find had been used to bind the man's hands and ankles. By the next morning, when the medical examiner was preparing to conduct an autopsy on the body found in the woods the night before, Detective May had already made much more progress on the case than she had believed possible when she had first laid eyes on the dead man. In fact, she now believed she had identified their John Doe. The young detective had spent the night before at her office putting out a statewide call for active reports on missing adult middle-aged white males. And within hours, she had gotten a call from the police department in Salisbury, North Carolina, 90 miles to the southeast. The lieutenant told her about a 41-year-old Swedish national named Victor Gunnarsson who had been reported missing by his landlord 23 days earlier on December 15, 1993. Victor's physical description, 41 years old, 6 foot 2 inches tall, 225 pounds, matched what Detective May had seen in the woods. But it was the recent photograph attached to the missing persons report from Salisbury that made the investigator's heart beat faster. The man in the photo with the dark hair and straight white teeth was wearing a gold watch and a heavy gold signet ring that looked exactly like the jewelry she had seen on the dead man in the woods. But it was what the Salisbury investigator told Detective May next, when she asked what else the officer knew about Victor Gunnarsson, that literally took Detective May's breath away. Because, as Detective May was about to find out, Victor Gunnarsson was no ordinary Swedish citizen. Victor Gunnarsson was in fact a major player in a political assassination that had taken place 8 years earlier, an assassination that was still unsolved and still the subject of international intrigue and speculation. That assassination had taken place on the evening of Friday, February 28, 1986, in the capital city of Stockholm, Sweden, when the country's popular prime minister and his wife, unescorted by bodyguards, were walking home from an evening out at the movies. The assassin had walked up behind the couple and fired 2 bullets at close range. The first hit Olof Palme in the back, killing him almost instantly, while the second bullet grazed and slightly injured Palme's wife, Lisbeth. And among the first suspects in that high-profile homicide was Victor Gunnarsson. Known at the time to Swedish police for his right-wing extremist views, Victor had been spotted earlier that same evening in a nearby bar where he had been heard ranting about the Prime Minister's socialist economic and foreign policies. Within hours of the shooting, Victor, who was then 33 years old, was picked up for questioning and then let go, only to be brought back into police custody 2 more times for detention and interrogation. He was finally released after an eyewitness to the assassination could not positively identify Victor as the shooter. But being released from police custody was not at all the same thing as being cleared of suspicion. As long as the case went unsolved, Victor remained a person of interest. As the target of continued surveillance as well as public mistrust, Victor had trouble keeping a job and living a normal life. So, after receiving a settlement for wrongful detention from the government, Victor decided it was time to leave Sweden and start a new life in America, where he eventually settled in Salisbury, North Carolina. Within days of Detective May's discovery, Swedish officials were able to confirm that the fingerprints taken from the man found in the North Carolina woods did match those of Victor Gunnarsson. By that time, the autopsy report had also come back. The contents in Victor's stomach, which included bits of potato skin, showed that he had probably eaten dinner about 4 hours before his death. The medical examiner had also determined that Victor had been bound with masking and electrical tape and confirmed that Victor had been killed execution style with 1 bullet to the head and 1 to the throat. The cause of death immediately ignited speculation in the US and in Sweden that Victor himself had become the victim of an assassination, and that his death must be related somehow to the 1986 murder of the Swedish Prime Minister. But as detectives in both Watauga County, where Victor's body was found, and in Salisbury, where Victor lived, began to work the homicide case together, what increasingly drew their attention wasn't just Victor's link to an 8-year-old political assassination, it was Victor's link to Salisbury resident and high school teacher Kay Whedon. What made that link interesting to detectives was the fact that Victor was not the only recent homicide victim who had lived in Salisbury and been a part of Kay's life. By now, results from Victor's autopsy, coupled with information detectives had gathered from Victor's friends and neighbors and from Kay herself, had helped police narrow the date of Victor's actual death to early December, probably around December 3rd, which was when Victor had gone out to dinner with Kay and eaten the baked potato, bits of which were later found inside of his stomach. And it was just a few days after December 3rd, on December 9th, that Kay Whedon's mother, 77-year-old Catherine Miller, had also been murdered. And like Victor, she had been shot twice in the head at close range. So, even as Detective May and law enforcement from the state and Salisbury Police Department continued to track down any information they could about Victor's political activities here in the United States, investigators also focused their attention on finding out all they could about Kay, the one person who represented the strongest link between two very similar brutal homicides that claimed the lives of two Salisbury residents. By the time Detective May joined forces with Salisbury investigators in mid-January, Salisbury police had already discovered that Kay herself also appeared to be in potential danger. Since Victor's disappearance and the death of her mother, Kay and her son Jason had both become the targets of telephone calls and letters accusing Jason of involvement with local drug dealers and threatening both mother and son with physical violence. When Kay sat down with investigators to tell them about her relationship with Victor, she told detectives that she had been crushed when Victor had not followed through on his promise to call her the day after their dinner together at the Blue Bay restaurant on December 3rd. But any worry or hurt Kay had felt about Victor's sudden silence and apparent disappearance, and any concern over the apparent stalker or stalkers who had started sending these awful letters and calling her and her son at all hours to threaten them, had been totally blotted out of her mind when she received the terrible news on December 9th that her mother had been murdered. That was the morning that Catherine's body had been found by a coworker from W.A. Brown, who had been so concerned that Catherine was late to work that he went directly to her home on Larch Street to make sure she was okay. When the coworker had stepped into Catherine's kitchen, he'd been horrified to find Catherine slumped in a seated position on the floor, her back against a white refrigerator and the top of her head blown off. After ruling out both Kay and her son Jason as suspects, police concentrated first on interviewing Catherine's friends and coworkers. Even though Catherine's house had a security system installed, there was no sign of forced entry, which made police believe the older woman must have known her attacker and opened the door to let them in. But after finding zero evidence that anyone close to Catherine would want her dead, police turned their attention again to Kay, thinking that Catherine's murder might be connected to something going on in Kay's life, or to someone close to Kay. People of interest had included Kay's former boyfriend, a Salisbury police officer named Lamont Claxton Underwood, who worked as a resource officer at Salisbury High School, as well as other men like David Sumner, who Kay had dated after she broke up with Officer Underwood and before she met Victor Gunnarsson. But no matter how hard they probed, detectives couldn't find any physical evidence to link anyone in Kay's circle of friends and acquaintances to the murder of Catherine Miller. But after the discovery of Victor's body, investigators in Salisbury had additional leads to follow. It looked to Detective May and Salisbury's lead investigator Don Gale like Victor Gunnarsson must have been kidnapped from his home in Salisbury and transported, probably by car, up to Watauga County where he was actually killed. But even after circling back to Officer Underwood, who had re-entered Kay's life as a friend after Kay's mother had died, and who had access to firearms, police still came up empty. All police discovered when they searched their fellow officer's home and car on February 1st, 1994, was that Lamont Claxton, LC for short, was neat to the point of being compulsive about order and cleanliness. As for a connection between Victor's murder and the assassination of Sweden's prime minister in 1986, that lead also petered out. Years before, Victor had apparently cut his ties to any right-wing extremist groups, and state and local police in North Carolina could not find one scrap of evidence among Victor's personal belongings or information gathered through interviews with his associates that related in any way to the death of Prime Minister Olof Palme. By the fall of 1994, 11 months after Victor Gunnarsson disappeared from his apartment in Salisbury, all the main characters in the unsolved murders of Victor and also Catherine Miller had started to move on with their lives. Kay, unable to stand being so close to the home where her mother had died, sold her house on Sycamore Road and moved to a new home 5 miles to the south, and the harassment that had terrorized her and Jason stopped. Both Kay and Elsie Underwood each had new romantic partners, and no one had stepped forward to claim a $50,000 reward offered by North Carolina's governor for information leading to the arrest and conviction of Victor's murderer, just as no one in Salisbury or Watauga County responded to a police bulletin asking for information about the .22 caliber weapon used to kill Victor, or the .38 caliber weapon used to kill Catherine. It wouldn't be until the fall of 1995, almost 2 years after Salisbury's 24,000 residents had been shaken to the core by those two homicides, that Watauga County Detective Paula May and Salisbury Detective Don Gale would get the news they had been hoping for, news that would once again shine the international spotlight on Victor Gunnarsson. On Wednesday, October 11th, an analyst for the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation placed a call to Detective May at her office up in the northwest corner of the state. After almost 2 years of reviewing the evidence and material samples that had been collected in the course of the Victor Gunnarsson investigation and finding nothing that would ID the murderer, the forensics expert had been ready to give up. But as he packed away one particular piece of material, he made a completely unexpected discovery. And using a brand new tool for analyzing DNA, the agent now believed he knew who had kidnapped and killed Kay's one-time boyfriend, Victor. Based on the results of that DNA test and the information investigators had gathered over the last 2 years, here is a reconstruction of what happened to Victor Gunnarsson on the night of December 3rd, 1993, and what happened to Catherine Miller 5 days later on the night of December 9th. It was right around midnight, and the moon was covered by clouds when Victor's killer turned into the parking lot at Lakewood Apartments and spotted Victor's big gray Lincoln Town Car parked right in front of Unit 910. The killer smiled at the lighted window of Victor's apartment. That was good. That meant the big Swede was still awake. Pulling the burgundy-colored Monte Carlo sedan in as close to Victor's unit as possible, the killer rolled to a stop and turned off the engine. Before leaving the car, the killer checked that they had everything they needed. Then there was the soft clunk as the car door closed, and then the quiet slap of footsteps as the killer walked to the front door of Victor's unit and rang the bell. A moment later, there was the sound of movement inside the apartment, then the doorknob turned, and the big friendly Swede suddenly appeared standing right inside. But the expression of puzzled welcome on Victor's face didn't last long. As soon as the door had opened, the killer was on the move, crowding Victor further back into the house and pulling out the .22 caliber pistol borrowed from a friend. Before Victor even had time to wrap his mind around what had just happened and who was standing inside his home, Victor was being forced out the door of his apartment, bands of tape covering his mouth and binding his hands tightly behind his back. Prodding Victor ahead of him to the Monte Carlo, the killer popped open the trunk and forced Victor to climb inside the cramped compartment, before quickly wrapping Victor's ankles together with more strips of electrical and masking tape. Then there was another clunk as the killer closed the trunk and stepped around to the driver's side, hopped behind the wheel, and turned on the engine. The killer paused just long enough to take a few calming breaths before easing slowly out of the apartment complex, the door to Victor's unit still open. The drive north from Salisbury to the intersection of Route 421 and the Blue Ridge Mountain Parkway took about an hour and 45 minutes. Coming from the rear of the car, the killer could hear the sound of Victor kicking at the top and sides of the trunk and the occasional scrape of something hard that sounded like metal on metal. As the killer approached the entrance ramp to the parkway, they slowed down, pulled over, and then parked the car. Here in the mountains, the edges of the road gave way almost immediately to thick, dense forest. And at this time of the year, when the parkway closed due to winter snow and ice, it could be months or never before anyone wandered into these woods, which was good because that meant the killer could finish this thing without hiking more than 300 or 400 yards into that black tangle of branches. Another calming breath, and the killer had gotten out of the driver's seat, closed the car door, and walked to the trunk. All the thumping and scraping had stopped. Time to pop the trunk, cut the bindings around Victor's ankles, and bring part 1 of the killer's plan to a close. A few minutes later, after forcing Victor to walk ahead at gunpoint up a slight hill, the killer skirted around the edge of a thicket of mountain laurel, then ordered Victor to stop walking. Facing them was the upended root ball of a fallen pine tree. Backing Victor into the shallow depression just in front of the snow-covered roots, the killer ordered Victor to strip off all of his clothes. Then, the killer wrapped a strip of masking and electrical tape around Victor's forehead. Pressing the barrel of the .22 against the tape on the left side of Victor's temple, right at the hairline, the killer pulled the trigger. Once Victor had fallen backward into the snow, the killer crouched down and quickly fired a second shot through the right side of Victor's throat. A moment later, and the killer had picked up the 2 spent shell casings and was pulling off the tape from around Victor's mouth and forehead and hands, and adding the strips with their incriminating load of DNA from Victor's hair and skin to the pile of Victor's clothing. As the killer's adrenaline rush started to wear off, the killer was suddenly shaky and very eager to get out of the dark woods. With any luck, no one would ever see Victor Gunnarsson again. The winter, snow, cold, and wild animals who would scatter his bones all over the forest would make sure of that. As the killer gathered up trace evidence and stood to walk back out to the road, the killer never noticed the 16-inch-long strip of masking and electrical tape they had dropped close to Victor's bare feet. 5 days later, Victor's killer was ready to complete the second part of their plan. All the risks were worth it, because after this, the killer was sure that the life they had wanted and planned would finally be within reach. So, on the evening of December 8, 1993, the killer knocked at the front door of Catherine Miller's house at 118 Larch Road. The single-story brick ranch was set far back from the road, so anyone driving by would have a hard time recognizing the person who stood with their back to the street at the top of the front steps. After the killer called out and identified themselves, the door opened. Catherine looked surprised and not completely pleased, but she still stepped back to allow her visitor inside. With the same wave of excitement the killer had felt entering Victor's apartment a few days earlier, the killer now pushed quickly into Catherine's living area. The sooner this was done, the better. Pulling out the gun, this time it was a .38 caliber revolver, the killer forced Catherine through the front of her house to the kitchen out back. There was a pan of beans for Catherine's dinner heating on the stove, and a copy of that day's Salisbury Post newspaper lying on the kitchen table. Catherine had turned, and then with no place left to go, she came to a stop with her back pressed against the refrigerator. Then, as the killer closed the distance left between them, Catherine stumbled, slipped, or simply slid down the door of the refrigerator until she was in a sitting position on the floor. Then, standing next to her, the killer fired 2 bullets down into the top of Catherine's head, sending fragments of bones, scalp, and hair in a spray along the floor and ceiling, and leaving a fan of blood spatter against the white refrigerator door. Stepping back, and careful to avoid stepping in any blood, the killer spent a few minutes staging the house to look like Catherine had been the victim of a robbery gone wrong. But the only thing of any value that police would find missing was Catherine's purse. Satisfied with their work, the killer left Catherine's house, returned to their car, started up the engine, and drove away, already thinking ahead to the sequence of events that would begin tomorrow morning. As soon as police discovered Catherine's dead body, they would inform Catherine's daughter, who lived just a few blocks away. And that was the moment when Salisbury police officer L.C. Underwood would be ready to reap the reward of having murdered the 2 people who stood between him and Kay Whedon, the woman he loved and wanted. With Victor gone, L.C. had eliminated his chief romantic rival, and with Catherine Miller dead, L.C. had eliminated the person closest to Kay, and the person who had never approved of her daughter's involvement with the police officer, who had heard all about how L.C. Underwood had showed up at the restaurant where Kay had met David Sumner for dinner, threatened to hurt both of them, and then dumped a full glass of iced tea right into Kay's lap. Now, with Victor and Catherine dead, not only would L.C. become Kay's indispensable man, L.C. was also the only person who could put an end to the harassment that had made Kay's life miserable ever since she had broken off her engagement to him a little over 1 year earlier. That part would be easy, since it was LC himself who had been Kay's stalker all along, sending her those threatening letters he had typed on a typewriter at his work office, and arranging for an ex-convict LC knew to harass Kay by phone. Just as it had been so easy for LC Underwood to drive by Kay Whedon's house on the night of December 3rd, when Kay and Victor sat holding hands together outside by the fire pit, turn around in the end of her driveway and take down the license number of Victor's car, then call up a buddy on the police force to run the plates and give LC Victor's home address. And not only had LC been able to use the power of his badge to help commit murder, his job as a police officer would allow him to keep an eye on the investigation into both deaths and stay one step ahead of investigators. But what LC Underwood did not expect when he killed both Victor and Catherine was that despite his mania for cleanliness and sanitizing a crime scene, he would leave behind 3 critical pieces of evidence that would eventually lead to his arrest. It would turn out that even before Catherine Miller had been murdered, Salisbury police, who were investigating Kay Whedon's reports that someone was harassing her, had already developed evidence that Kay's own ex-boyfriend, LC Underwood, was also Kay's stalker. Police had seized the typewriter ribbon from LC's work typewriter at the local high school where he was a resource officer. That typewriter ribbon was the first piece of critical evidence that would eventually tie LC to murder. On that typewriter ribbon, police found words that appeared in the letters of harassment that Kay had shown police. Even though Kay herself had refused to believe that LC could be her stalker, when Kay's mother, Catherine, was murdered, LC, who had been vocal about his run-ins with Catherine, quickly became investigators' primary suspect. But it wasn't until Victor Gunnarson's body was discovered, naked and dead up in the Blue Ridge Mountains, that police were able to collect the second and third pieces of evidence that would send LC to prison. When police searched LC's house back in February of 1993, almost 2 months after Victor's disappearance, they found a roll of electrical tape that they were later able to identify as the same kind of tape as the strip of tape that police found at the scene of Victor's murder. And during that same search, in the trunk of LC's Monte Carlo, there were boot prints and scratches on the underside of the lid. And even though LC had had the car thoroughly and professionally cleaned, when detectives sent in the mats from the bottom of the trunk to the state crime lab for examination, forensic specialists would eventually recover 17 hairs embedded in the mat fibers. The call that Detective Paula May had received on October 11, 1995, was confirmation from the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation Crime Lab that DNA from all 17 of those hairs found in the trunk of LC Underwood's Monte Carlo were a match for Victor Gunnerson. On October 13, 1995, one day after receiving those DNA results, and just under 2 years after Victor disappeared, police arrested 44-year-old police officer LC Underwood and charged him with first-degree murder and first-degree kidnapping in the death of Swedish national Victor Gunnarsson. 3.5 years later, on Monday, July 21, 1997, Lamont Claxton Underwood was found guilty of both charges and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Although the court allowed the prosecution to present evidence from Catherine Miller's murder as part of the state's case against LC Underwood was never formally charged with Catherine's murder. On Christmas Day 2018, after serving 21 years of his life sentence, LC Underwood died in prison of kidney cancer at the age of 67. In June 2020, 34 years after Victor Gunnarsson was questioned as a possible suspect in the assassination of Sweden's Prime Minister Olof Palme, Swedish prosecutors announced that they had finally solved the puzzle of who really did shoot Olof Palme. According to prosecutors, the man, who had no connection to Victor, was a professional graphic designer who had put himself forward at the time of the assassination as an eyewitness to the Prime Minister's death. As for Victor Gunnarsson, twice in his life, the big talker with the big smile was in absolutely the wrong place at absolutely the wrong time. His first piece of bad luck, when he was in a bar nearby the place where Olof Palme was gunned down, resulted in Victor's persecution and his move to the United States. The second piece of bad luck, when he met Kay Whedon, a woman he would date for less than a month, resulted in Victor's death.
On September 19th, 2013, 69-year-old retired middle school teacher Amy Linkert and her friend, 63-year-old Joe Blakesley, who was a physician, headed off to the Craters on the Moon Park in Idaho. This park is actually a dormant volcano. It's not extinct. It's going to be active again, probably in the next 1,000 years. But for now, it's this beautiful park that is known for these crazy lava fields that look otherworldly. Barely any vegetation can grow on them, and there's just a strip of pavement they've kind of weaved through these massive jagged lava fields. And then you have all these big mounds that are the actual volcanoes. Another feature of this park are all the lava tubes underground. All the molten lava, when it jets around underneath the surface before shooting out, it carves these natural tunnels underground, these huge caverns. They're like these big caves you can explore. And there's 1,100 miles of lava tubes, tunnels, and caves underneath this park. The two women told their families they would be back in Boise, Idaho by the 21st, but when the 21st came and they were not home, their families were suspicious. They tried calling them, they didn't pick up, and for the next 36 hours, they just kept trying to call them and called around to see if anybody else knew where they were. And then finally, on the morning of the 23rd, when no one knew where they were, they reached out to the authorities. The formal search for these two women began on the 24th, so 5 days after they had initially left for this trip, and the searchers quickly found their pickup truck parked in the parking lot of the Craters on the Moon Park. And in their truck were their two dogs, who were alive, they were okay, and in the front seat were their purses and their cell phones, but there was no sign of Amy or Joe. This was obviously a bad sign, and so the search was really kicked into high gear to see if they could find these women before it was too late. But unfortunately, within 24 hours of finding the truck, they would find Amy's body. And her body was located way off of the main trail. She was in an area that the park superintendent described as incredibly rugged and inaccessible. Now, at this park, there is a strip of cement that weaves through this really dangerous lava field. And if you were on this strip of cement, you wouldn't be thinking about walking onto the lava field. Not only would you need to navigate all these massive mounds of jagged, cooled lava, there's all these cracks in the ground that you could fall through and just plummet to your death. So no one's about to start walking off the trail, especially not two older women that went here just to have a casual stroll through the park. They were not there for some grand adventure. They were not athletic distance hikers. It made no sense that Amy would be so far off the trail in an area that was so dangerous and so clearly off limits. When the families were notified that Amy had been found and they were still looking for Joe, the detail that the family keyed in on was the idea that these two women left their dogs in the truck. That was something so unbelievably uncharacteristic of either of them. They adored those two dogs. They would never, ever abandon them like that. In fact, because of that detail, the families jumped to this has to be foul play because they never would have done that. They wouldn't have abandoned these precious dogs. The search for Joe would continue. They basically shifted the entire effort to center over Amy where she was found and work in circles out from there to see if they could find her. They had helicopters flying overhead. They had mining experts walking through all the lava tubes below, and they couldn't find her. Finally, on October 23rd, so 28 days after Amy was found, Joe's body was discovered as well. And she was lying 1 mile away from where Amy had been found in a similarly inaccessible part of the park that would have required significant climbing over jagged, cooled lava fields and all these cracks in the ground she would have had to navigate to reach where she was. And even more strangely is the area where she was found had been searched extensively by air with helicopter pilots flying overhead and by cadaver sniffing dogs that had been in that area and they had not picked up her scent. So either the helicopter pilots and the cadaver sniffing dogs were just wrong or missed something, or Joe had not been there the whole time. A cause of death has not been determined for either of the two women. However, what was released is neither of them appeared to have suffered an incapacitating injury, meaning they weren't struck down where they were. They were traveling and ultimately stopped where they were. It seems highly unlikely that these two women abandoned their two dogs and left their cell phones in the car and then wandered way off the trail and separated from each other, all without supplies. But even if they had done that, even if they had, separated and left the trail, Where they ultimately reached seems like an area they would not have been able to get to without assistance, and since they were separated, they weren't able to help each other get where they were. So although authorities have ruled out foul play, this was deemed an accident, it does seem like if there was ever a place to commit an attack, it would be this particular park, because underneath the park is 1,100 miles of lava tubes that connect to each other and weave all through the park, and there's hundreds of caves, many of which have not been found or explored, that it would be pretty straightforward to attack someone and then go underground and not be found. Certainly makes you wonder who or what could be hiding underground in those lava tubes.
Our next story is called Stay in the Car. Before dawn on December 12, 1992, a 17-year-old girl named Tracy Dion sat in the passenger seat of a little two-door car that was swerving down a deserted road in the Yankton Sioux Reservation in South Dakota. Everybody in the car was drunk, including Tracy. Sitting next to Tracy in the middle front seat was her 19-year-old cousin named Ruby, and Ruby's boyfriend, a 20-year-old named Arnold, was driving the car. All three of them had been out partying all night, and so now they were trying to make it home. The swerving was making Tracy feel sick to her stomach, but she didn't want to say anything to Arnold in fear that she might distract him. I mean, it was really dark outside, there was no street lights, there was ice on the road. I mean, for a sober driver, this would be a challenging drive, let alone a drunk driver. They were coming up on an intersection, and Arnold brought the car to a stop with a lurch. Tracy watched as Arnold checked for cross traffic and then pulled out onto Highway 281. But halfway through this turn, as Arnold was accelerating, Tracy began to feel the car slide. And even in her drunken state, she could tell Arnold had hit a patch of black ice. And so as the car began to skid, she wanted to scream, but before she could, the car was already flipping over, and then everything went black. A short time later, Tracy came to. The car was upside down, and Tracy quickly realized she had fallen out of her seat and was now basically resting on the roof of the car, which was now on the ground. From what she could tell, after the car had finished rolling over, it had come to a stop just off the side of the highway, and so they were not in immediate danger from other cars striking them. But she couldn't really see outside because the windows were so badly cracked. Beside her, Tracy could hear her cousin, Ruby, pounding on the driver's side door trying to get it to open, and so Tracy tried to look around Ruby to see Arnold to see if he was okay, but when she did, she saw the driver's seat was empty. Tracy tried to make sense of what she was seeing. The driver's side door was closed, but Arnold was gone. Just then, Tracy heard the sound of the driver's side door opening, and she turned to see her cousin Ruby forcing the door open just a few inches, and then a second later, Ruby was slithering out through that crack to the outside. To Tracy, everything felt like it was happening in slow motion. She was too shocked and confused to make any sense of it. But if Ruby was getting out of the car, Tracy felt like she should too. And so Tracy turned and crawled across to the driver's side and was about to make an exit the same way Ruby had when the door slammed shut violently right in Tracy's face. Tracy didn't understand why Ruby would do something like that. Why would she shut the door that aggressively when she knew her cousin was still inside? Tracy tried to open the door again, but she was too weak to do it. She figured her cousin Ruby was okay, but she couldn't see outside because of how cracked the windows were. At this point, Tracy began to feel woozy. She laid her head down on the roof of the car, wondering to herself why Ruby and Arnold had left her behind. Tracy would stay trapped inside of the car, alone, for a few hours, until finally a motorist saw the flipped-over car and called 911. Shortly after that, first responders arrived on the scene, they pulled Tracy out of the car, and shockingly, she actually didn't have really any serious injuries at all. She didn't even need to be hospitalized. But rescuers could not find Ruby or Arnold anywhere. They were gone. And once rescuers had scoured the entire area around the crash site, the sheriff who was in charge of the scene started to wonder if Arnold and Ruby were not just missing. Maybe, he thought, they had fled. Arnold had been driving drunk, and all three of them were underage, and so the sheriff thought maybe Arnold and Ruby were scared to get in trouble. Over the next few days, the police continued to search the surrounding area for Arnold and Ruby, hoping they were not badly injured and that they would just turn up on their own, but they never did. And as the days turned into weeks, hope began to wane for the young couple. Their family and friends kept searching the area along 281 where the car had flipped, looking for any clue as to where these two had gone. But there was nothing. There was no trace of them. It was like Arnold and Ruby had gotten out of the car and just vanished. But in January of 1993, so 3 weeks after the crash, strange and conflicting reports of sightings began to trickle in. First, a woman came forward claiming to have seen Arnold, alive and well, at a New Year's Eve party. Now, the police doubted this claim, but this woman was insistent that she had seen Arnold. And they actually hooked her up to a lie detector test, and she passed the test. And so officials brought in guests from this party who this woman claimed were with Arnold, and they asked them, "Were you with Arnold?" And they said no, but they failed their lie detector tests. Now, of course, this was suspicious, but police really didn't know what to do with this information. Assuming this woman's story was true, that she really did see Arnold, well, according to the details of her story, Arnold did not appear to be in any kind of distress. And even if he was in distress, the police still had no idea where he was, so how could they help him? Other locals came forward, claiming to have spotted Arnold around town as well. But nothing came of those reports either. Neither Arnold nor Ruby turned up. Months went by, and the case went cold. Until March 10th, when a driver was going down Highway 281 and they noticed a strange object in the drainage ditch next to the road. By now, the weather was much warmer than it had been on the day of the crash, so instead of snow and ice inside of this drainage ditch, it was runoff water. And the strange object was floating in it. The driver stopped his car, got out, and walked up to see what this thing was, and as soon as he saw it, he turned, ran back to his car, and called the police. Because what the driver had just found was a dead body. And when the police arrived and searched the area, they found another body not far away. The bodies belonged to Ruby and Arnold. But this discovery did not solve the mystery of what happened to Ruby and Arnold. Instead, it made it much more bizarre. Because first of all, the bodies were found 75 feet away from the original crash site. And the exact spots where the two bodies were found had been searched many, many times on the day of the crash, days after the crash. They were searched by police, they were searched by friends and family of Ruby and Arnold. The idea that this is where the bodies had been the whole time was impossible. They would have been found. And then there was the condition of the bodies. Ruby's body was extremely decomposed, which made sense given the fact that the crash was 3 months earlier. But Arnold's body was barely decomposed at all. And in the pocket of Arnold's jeans, police found a mysterious set of 3 keys. 1 was a vehicle key and 2 were house keys. But none of them opened any vehicle or building that Arnold was known to frequent, and nobody recognized them. Finally, the police found a tuft of hair lying near where the bodies had been found. It was Ruby's hair, but it didn't look like the hair had been there for very long, certainly not 3 months. Instead of being dirty and matted, like you would expect given how long she must have been there, the hair was perfectly clean. The official coroner's report on Ruby and Arnold's deaths were that they died of exposure, and then their bodies were just overlooked by searchers for months. But to a lot of people, including the sheriff who was in charge of the original crash site, this made no sense. Despite the coroner's findings, law enforcement officials believed that Ruby and Arnold's deaths were the result of foul play. Under the foul play theory, somebody pulled Ruby and Arnold out of the crash site while they were still alive and then killed them later. And then perhaps they killed them at different times, which would account for the differences in decomposition of their bodies. The FBI ultimately came in and took over this case, but they eventually closed it down, citing a lack of evidence to support the foul play theory. However, with or without foul play being involved here, nobody has a good explanation for all those sightings of Arnold after the crash. And also, nobody can explain why the door was slammed in Tracy's face in the immediate aftermath of the crash. Maybe it was Ruby or Arnold who slammed the door, or maybe it was their killer. To this day, what actually happened on December 12, 1992, on the side of Highway 281, remains a mystery. The third and final story of today's episode is called What Just Happened.
Growing up, Colton Louder was a joy to be around. He was always goofing off and making people smile, and he had a really infectious laugh. But secretly, he was depressed and began self-medicating at a very young age. By the time he was 18, he was a full-fledged drug addict, and by the time he was 25, he was in jail on a life sentence for murdering his uncle over a drug-related dispute. Colton's actions had a profound impact on his family, but none more so than on his twin sister, Kaylin. She had known about his pain even when he was putting on that facade of being happy and bubbly and outgoing, and she had reached out to him and tried to help him, but she could never get through to him, and when he was ultimately convicted, it was crushing to her. She felt like she couldn't help someone who was really vulnerable. But instead of just feeling bad about this, she took her sadness about her brother and watching him spiral and turned that into a laser focus on helping other vulnerable people that were struggling with addiction and depression to try to help them before they end up like her brother. And eventually she would get her degree in social work from Utah State. But despite Kaylin's best intentions to want to help as many people as she could, she found it very difficult to find work in her field, and it wasn't uncommon for her to have fairly long stretches of unemployment. And it was during one of those long stretches in 2014 that Kaylin's life rapidly fell apart, and it left everybody who knew her thinking, what just happened? On September 26, 2014, a little after 9 p.m., Kaylin calls 911. She reported that there was this huge, brutal fight taking place in her condo's clubhouse. Basically, it was like a restaurant where you could rent it out in the first floor of this condo complex. And she said it was getting out of hand and police needed to come over here and stop it before someone got hurt. The police asked her if weapons were involved. Were people using weapons in this fight? And Kaylin says, yes, guns. But when police rushed to the scene, bracing for the worst, they discover that it's just a docile wedding reception happening inside of this clubhouse, and not one person in there reported any altercation happening. They were like, we're being pretty quiet. I don't know where she would have got that from. One guest would tell police that they had lit off a single firecracker, but they showed them what they had used, and they were these little tiny cheap things that made almost no noise. So it is possible that Kaylin could have mistaken that for a gunshot, but it does seem highly unlikely. Police leave, and then 1 hour later, Kaylin calls 911 again, but she immediately hangs up as soon as an operator has actually answered the phone. And the operator calls the number back, and Kaylin picks the phone up, but she's not really speaking. She's mumbling, she sounds confused, and the operator said, hey, you tried to call 911 a minute ago. Is everything okay? Can you tell me where you are? And Kaylin would have a really hard time giving her address to the police. It was like she couldn't remember her address. And she's mumbling, and at some point she says, my roommate thinks I'm delusional and paranoid, but I'm not. Kaylin eventually kind of calmed down and said she was sorry for calling 911, and the operator said okay, and they hung up, and that was the end of the call. The next morning, Kaylin calls 911 for a third time in 24 hours. This time, she's frantic. While she's on the phone with the operator, she's periodically screaming at these two people that are apparently robbing her apartment to get the F out of here, get out of my apartment, you can't be here. And the operator is trying to get more information out of Kaylin, but Kaylin is very distressed. She can barely communicate with the operator. She's half crying, and the operator tells her, can you leave? Can you go somewhere safe? And Kaylin says, no, there's only one way out. This is a small apartment. I can't go past them. And the operator tells them that police are on their way. Just stay in your bedroom. Don't go anywhere. And so while Kaylin is huddled in her bedroom and the dispatcher is still on the line listening, you hear Kaylin's roommate, Carol, walk into her bedroom and very calmly say, Kaylin, what's going on? And Kaylin's like, Carol, get over here. You gotta lock the door. Get in here. There's two people in here. They're robbing us. They're out there. They're in the other room. And Carol's like, no. There's no one here. The front door's locked. Kaylin suddenly sounds really confused, and she says, well, I can't explain that, but they must have been in here because I heard them. They must have had a key, and that's how they got in, and that's how they got out. And right at that moment, the responding officers show up, and there was no sign of a break-in. Nothing had been taken. It really looked like nothing had happened, unless someone really did have a key. At this point, Kaylin was very embarrassed. She apologized to the officers, she apologized to her roommate, and she ended up calling her mom and saying, "I'm mortified. I can't believe I just called 911 3 different times and nothing came of any of these calls. Like, I feel so embarrassed about it." And her mom, being a good mom, told her, "You know what, don't worry about it. No one got hurt in the process, so it's all good." And so Kaylin moves past it, and on the call with her mom, she starts talking about what she's going to do that day. She says, "Well, I'm looking to update my resume and submit it to a couple different job openings, and I also want to clean up my apartment." And so they hang up the phone and everything seems normal again. But at about 5:45 p.m. that night, Kaylin, along with her beloved little dog named Phyllis that apparently she took everywhere with her, were seen exiting the condo and walking out to the parking lot behind their building. Kaylin was barefoot, was only wearing a tank top and shorts, despite the fact that it was cold and raining. And as soon as she puts her dog down, because she was holding her dog in her arm, Kaylin begins having this totally animated discussion, except there's no one there for her to be talking to. About 15 minutes later, she and her dog turn around and walk back towards the condo complex out of view of a camera, but residents would say they saw her crying and going up to a gate that lets you back into the condo, and she apparently couldn't open it. And as she's standing there struggling, she suddenly stops, puts her dog down, turns, and starts running away. And the camera footage we have of her is only when she's back in the parking lot, but she's running away still, and the dog is nowhere to be found. Her beloved dog, she's abandoned, she's got no phone, no wallet, and nobody knows where she's going. Later that night, when Kaylin's family could not get in touch with her, because of all the weirdness around those 911 calls, her family just had a bad feeling about it, and so they filed an official missing person report that night. When police arrived at the condo complex, the first thing they did is they reviewed the security footage. And they already knew about her 3 911 calls that had happened within 24 hours, and all of them had been for unfounded reasons. And they see Kaylin on camera, barefoot in a tank top and shorts in the rain, and she's having this animated discussion with nobody before running around and running away. And so police go to Kaylin's family and they say, "Does your daughter have a drug problem? Is she mentally ill?" And her family tells the police, no, she's got no history of mental illness. She definitely does not have a drug addiction because of what happened to her brother. And they explain what happened with Colton and how that had a tremendous impact on her, and how that had actually sent her on a course to help people with mental illness or people who are fighting against addiction or depression. And they explained how she was just really well adjusted and everything seemed okay until these 911 calls started, and now this. So this huge search is launched between the police and volunteers, and actually the Louder family even hired some private investigators to help them look for Kaylin. But days turned into weeks and there was no leads, no one knew where she was. She just vanished. Then on December 1st, 10 weeks after she went missing, city workers were inspecting drainage pipes down near the Jordan River, which was a river that went by her apartment, and they discovered behind some plants a body that was half submerged, and it would turn out to be Kaylin's. They pull her out of the water and no cause of death could be accurately determined because of how long she had been in the water for. It looked like she had been in there for probably all of the 10 weeks she had been missing. They were able to determine that there were no drugs in her system and there was no water in her lungs, which meant she didn't drown. Her body was found 5 miles from where her apartment was, and so initial speculation was she must have gotten hurt and fallen into this river and drifted the 5 miles downstream to where she was found. But they looked at that section of the river between her apartment and where she was found, and the water was simply too shallow and windy, and it would not have been possible for a human body to travel that distance. Which means almost immediately after she ran off screen on the security footage, she covered those 5 miles, wound up at that section of the Jordan River, died, and then fell in the water, or fell in the water and then died, but not via drowning. The police officially ruled Kaylin's death an accident, but her family disagrees. They say if you look really closely at the security footage right before she runs away, it looks like she's terrified. More specifically, it looks like she's terrified of someone we can't see on camera. When she's having that animated discussion where it looks like she's talking to no one, further feeding the idea that she had kind of lost it, well, there's this huge rock to the right in the video that kind of obscures our view, and behind that is this huge forest. And it is theoretically possible that someone could be back there that we can't see. But no matter what, her family believes that whatever she was doing in her final moments on camera is the key to understanding why she ran off and ultimately died. So, you be the judge. Was this a psychotic break, or is there something more?
City lights don't sleep at night. They blink like they know my name. People rushing past my life, but none of them feel the same. Cafes full, streets alive. Laughter spills into the air. I sit right here, scrolling time, wondering if anyone cares. I talk to walls made out of sound. So many voices, none stick around. It's funny how you can be seen and still feel like nobody's found you. I'm alone in the noise tonight, surrounded but not inside. 1,000 faces, flashing signs, still no place that feels like mine. I'm alone where
A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The MrBallen podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, MrBallen.